Welcome to this Bipartisan Policy Center event. New speaker, same Congress, the path ahead for governing in the House. I'm Michael Thorning, Director of Structural Democracy here at BPC. In just about an hour, the House Republican Conference is going to begin its nominating contest for a new speaker. And voting on the House floor could begin, if everything goes smoothly, as soon as 3 p.m. today. So for this very timely conversation, we're joined today by two distinguished guests who undoubtedly have insights into what's going on Capitol Hill at this moment. Former Representative Rodney Davis and former Representative Ed Perlmutter. Mr. Davis, Republican, represented Illinois' 13th Congressional District from 2013 to 2023. And a great honor for us here at BPC. Mr. Davis joined the Bipartisan Policy Center as a senior fellow this year. Mr. Perlmutter, a Democrat, represented Colorado's 7th Congressional District from 2007 to 2023. And both served on the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, a real passion project for us here at BPC. Thank you both for joining us this morning.
Good to be here.
Last week, we saw congressional history made, the first ever successful ouster of a Speaker of the House. What was your reaction to that, and how did we get here?
Well, my reaction was sadness. Kevin McCarthy is a very good friend of mine. I was one of his leadership appointed committee chairs. I worked very closely with him my entire 10 years in Congress. I consider him not only one of the best members of our leadership team that I ever had a chance to work with, but I consider him a friend. So watching him go through what he had to go through because he made the choice to govern and stop the country from costing taxpayers more money by going into a government shutdown. He knew that this could be the end result. He was willing to sacrifice his own speakership for the betterment of our country. So that sadness, and then I felt a little bit of anger too at some of the performance artists that were my former colleagues that care more about how many likes they would get on a social media post or how many Sunday show interviews that they will get on a weekly or monthly basis than they do about actually doing their job to govern. So sadness and anger was what I felt that day.
I guess I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed. I was elected same year as Kevin or vice versa. And, you could see this coming for some time. I mean, let's just go back to John Boehner. Had trouble with some ideological kind of extremist in the Republican Party. Then Paul Ryan was sort of subjected to that. And then Kevin, just did it for everybody to see whether it was 15 rounds to get elected and then always be under this threat of an ouster. But clearly it's never happened in the history of the country. And it was... you could see it coming, but the fact that it happened is actually pretty surprising and unprecedented.
We've now had back-to-back Congresses with very slim majorities, one Democratic, one Republican. One scholar has even dubbed this an era of insecure majorities, with neither party seen as having a lock on the majority in Congress, and very competitive elections for the most part. How can Congress get to agreement in an era like this? And, can the House really still be governed strictly as a majoritarian body? Or in these situations, is reaching across the aisle really necessary?
I'll jump in on that one. I think reaching across the aisle is necessary. And from a legislator standpoint, it's more fun. Instead of always doing, combat and saying that you have the lock on all the answers. Working together with people is part of what government and Congress is all about. And we really have tried to govern from a majoritarian standpoint. But when you have just a 4 or 5 vote majority, one, it's hard to do it based on the majority. And two, you can come up with better products that ultimately serve the nation better if you're working with the other side and working with each other and trying to come up with good answers. So, Rodney and I have worked on things together. It just is, from a personal standpoint, it's, for me, it was always more satisfying to be able to work out deals. And there's still a lot of that goes on, but there is a lot of that has been lost. And I think it's necessary to get back there.
Eddie Perlmutter, the deal maker, the consummate member of Congress who turns it into a swamp. That's what you are? Is that what you just said? Hey, look, in all seriousness, I wish we had more Ed Perlmutters that were willing to strike some bipartisan deals. And frankly, Ed and I served together for 10 years, and there was a lot more bipartisan agreement because of folks like Ed and me and others that wanted to govern than what was actually reported in the media. Because the media likes to report when we fight. It's entertainment value. It jacks up ratings. They don't ask us to come on and joke with each other and actually show the world that we like each other like we do, and that we're friends, and that we can actually find common ground. But here's the bad part, because Ed and I left after the 2022 election cycle, and what's not taken into consideration is that most states, whether they were governed by Republicans or governed by Democrats, have completely gerrymandered congressional districts to where the number of competitive districts like the one I ran in for 10 years have defied expectations. Because Ed can tell you, every DCCC meeting he went to, they had me on the list. And I loved being on that list because I could raise more money and I could actually come back and say, I got you again. Well, Democrats in Illinois created a gerrymandered map that threw Republicans into solid hardcore Republican districts, which make them more apt to elect people who don't want to work together, who don't want to govern. That, with the lack of competitive districts and the margins that the House is right now, you're probably going to have, over this next decade, the House flip back and forth multiple times, which means there is less and less and less of a chance that guys like Eddie Perlmutter and me can actually get something done in a bipartisan way.
Mr. Davis, your party right now is in the midst of a speaker contest, trying to decide who the next leader is going to be, not just for the party, but also for the House. They may start voting as early as today. The speaker contest seems to be revealing some, fissures or factions within the party. And several of your colleagues have expressed skepticism that this will be resolved today or even this week. So what's your advice for your former colleagues right now?
Well, you might want to call me a skeptic too. My advice to my former colleagues is pass the rules change that would allow for Republicans to hash out their differences in a conference room full of Republicans rather than in 15 rounds on the House floor. That to me would give us a chance to come out unified. Because Democrats have clearly shown they don't want to choose governing, because they could have done that by not showing up to the motion to vacate. And look, it's politics. They ought to come out and say it's politics rather than saying, oh, here's our plan to govern. Well, it maybe could have done that before Republicans, as you knew, were going to have a very select few of arsonists who care only about attention get us to this point. So I hope they pass the rules change. I hope we come to a consensus and get a speaker. If not, I think there's going to be a delayed vote to actually give us a full-time speaker way past today.
Just a quick follow-up. One of the discussions that's kind of materialized in the last few days is about also changing the conference rules, trying to increase the threshold for someone to even be nominated by the Republican conference for speaker. Do you think that would be helpful, or is that going to make things harder?
No, that's the rule that I'm talking about. Okay. That rule will be debated before a speaker's election today. And what it would do is it would it would require Republicans to get 217 votes in conference rather than what the current rule is just a simple majority.
Right. Mr. Perlmutter, you're no stranger to speaker contests and the maneuvering that goes into that, and trying to get changes in the way the House is run, the way that your own party caucus is run. In 2019, you were a part of some efforts to get concessions from Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi, who would go on to become Speaker. What were the goals there, and what advice or lessons do you have for Republicans right now who want to see change in the institution?
Well, I think for me, there were two goals. One was it was time to pass the torch. From an ideological standpoint, a policy standpoint, I was, just right there with Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and Jim Clyburn. They were fantastic leaders, but there is a point where you pass the torch to a new generation of leaders. So that was really the first and foremost goal that I think some of us had, and it worked out very well. We reached a deal. Nancy Pelosi is a woman of her word. She honored it. And we now have Hakeem Jeffries and a new group of leaders, which I think is time. And the older leadership, the Steny and Nancy and Jim, can be mentors, advisors, coaches for leadership in a way, in a time where, there's a lot of things happening, good and bad, in the world. And this, I think, made the Democratic caucus stronger. The other thing we did, and you mentioned it earlier, Michael, was create the Modernization of Congress Committee to really try to develop things in a bipartisan way to improve the way the House functions, whether it dealt with personnel or technology or procedure. And we got a lot accomplished in that. And I think those were the two main goals. I think the Republicans, there've been, I think part of it is, as Rodney said, sort of drama and showmanship. For some people, it doesn't really matter what the issue is, but some of it is ideological. And for us, it was more timing and trying to make the place run better. We got those concessions.
And, so would you say the takeaway is that now is a time where, members can really leverage their votes in this contest to try to get some changes agreed to?
Yes, I think that, Kevin McCarthy was in a position where he was having to make concessions all over the place, and some of them were really contrary to managing the affairs of the Congress as a speaker, to be able to, give up to have any one person come to the floor, or any one of the majority party, the Republicans, and bring an issue of vacating the chair up. And so, for me, you can modify those rules. You can try to do some things that would attract Democrats, in composition of some committees, or just say, look, we're going to adhere to the, and I would differ with Rodney on this. There was a bipartisan decision when the debt ceiling vote came up, and it really established what was going to happen going forward on appropriations bills and things like that, but that wasn't followed. And we need to, I think if we adhered to the debt ceiling agreement that Democrats and Republicans reached, and maybe did some changes of composition of some of the committees, starting with the Rules Committee, I think there would be a real bipartisan, strong center of the Congress driving legislation instead of just sort of being whipsawed by the extremes of both parties.
You both have been at the center of some of the more procedural and operational questions going on in the House. Mr. Perlmutter, you were on the Rules Committee, and Mr. Davis, you were on the House Administration Committee and the Republican ranking member on that. The House is currently without a permanent speaker, and Representative Patrick McHenry is acting as Speaker pro tempore under the rules of the House. That's raised some questions in the last week just about how much authority and latitude he has in that role. given that it's sort of a placeholder. The timing of this was already fraught, just given that we were under sort of a 40-some day deadline for funding the government again. And, what no one really saw coming maybe was the horrific attack on Israel by Hamas that seems to have added imperative maybe for Congress to act in the coming days or weeks. Can Mr. McHenry preside over more than just electing the speaker if necessary? For instance, if Congress, decides it needs to act and there's a protracted election for speaker, is he in a position to do that?
Well, go ahead, Rodney, go ahead. I've got some ideas, but go ahead.
Well, it's basically it's up to the parliamentarian. I mean, remember, we have never seen this happen before in the history of our country, to have a speaker kicked out through a motion to vacate, and having the speaker pro tem that was created in a post 9/11 law come into play here. There hasn't been any precedents that have been set about what power he or she would have. So Democrats, and rightfully so, are chirping in the parliamentarian's ear, basically saying Speaker pro tem McHenry is just a figurehead. He can't do anything. And Republicans are saying, conversely, he ought to be able to run very important pieces of legislation through. Hopefully, there can be a compromise. And if there is no speaker today, or no speaker even this week, that either Republicans will come together on their own and elect a speaker that will serve in the short term, that could be anywhere from a few weeks to a few months, or to the rest of this Congress, and then live to fight another day afterwards. And if that's the case, then we kind of get back to normalcy. And I will tell you too, I certainly wish we weren't even at this point. I was sad and I was angry when Kevin McCarthy was ousted. There was a golden opportunity for Republicans and Democrats who consider themselves the governing part of Congress, like Ed and I did, to really get the rules changes that Ed talked about earlier. And that could have happened before McCarthy was ousted, but neither side decided to make that deal. And that's why we are where we are today, and it's really uncharted territory.
I guess what I would say is I agree with Rodney. I think at this point it's uncharted. There are some things. There's an encyclopedia of rules called Deschler on procedure, and which has followed sort of the rules of the House since we began the country. And at this point, the Speaker pro tem has pretty limited authority, because there's two types of Speaker pro tems: elected Speaker pro tem and a designated Speaker pro tem. An elected Speaker pro tem has more authority than a designated Speaker pro tem, and McHenry is a designated Speaker pro tem. And we did it, and this was something that the Bipartisan Policy Center looked to us to try to do, was deal with instances where there might be a catastrophe, and how do you keep Congress going? So we did do one thing. We said, okay, in the event there's no speaker, the speaker needs to have a list of people to follow in his footsteps, but they're just designated and they really don't have a lot of authority. Now, Rodney's right. The first place it'll be is the parliamentarian. The parliamentarian will be asked to say, does the speaker have the right to move legislation forward? Or, can he rule on this thing? The parliamentarian may say yes or no, but then 218 members of the House can say, we want to move forward, or no, he doesn't have this authority. So ultimately, it will be up to the House to decide how far Patrick McHenry can go in terms of moving things forward. So it's again, with a lot of new ground is being covered here, and I don't think we know, but I do know if you get 218 votes in the House, you can move things forward, whatever it might be.
So there is this.
That's a great point. And I want to remind our viewers that if you have questions you want to ask our panelists, you can do so on Facebook or on YouTube using the live chat. And if you'd like to submit them on Twitter, you can do that using the hashtag BPC Live. We're going to get to questions here just in a few minutes, but I want to ask both of you about another development that happened last week. Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, in an op-ed, invited Republicans to form a bipartisan coalition to lead the House. Mr. Davis, is that realistically on the table right now? And what would need to happen for it to actually be if it's not?
Well, how convenient for Leader Jeffries to come out with this plan after every single Democrat watched Kevin McCarthy, who had just put up a bill that Democrats voted for to avoid a government shutdown. How convenient of him to write the op-ed after Republicans didn't have a Speaker of the House. The time for bipartisanship, the time to force rules changes, the time where Democrats actually had the leverage to force some bipartisan agreements that they say they want, but I don't actually believe they want, because they would rather have Republicans in chaos. Leader Jeffries is a friend of mine. I respect him. I like him personally, but this was 100% political CYA.
Well, okay. And Rodney is my buddy, and Kevin's been a friend of mine a long time. But the bottom line was the Democratic caucus no longer trusted Kevin McCarthy for a whole bunch of reasons, going back to January 6th. And, I think personally that there is the opportunity for a bipartisan coalition to start managing and governing the House of Representatives, and in part managing and governing the United States of America. Honestly, whether it's, I've got lots of friends over on the Republican side of the aisle, and, if it were a Rodney Davis or a Frank Lucas or a Patrick McHenry, people who you may disagree with politically, but who you really say, okay, this guy is going to carry through on what he says he's going to carry through, then I think there's a real opportunity for a bipartisan approach to this. And it would be something that's new, at least in modern ages. In the old days, there was always, you were looking for votes. You didn't care if it came from a Republican or a Democrat. You wanted to move an issue forward, and you move forward in a bipartisan way. That's fallen by the wayside in the last 50, 100 years. I think it's time to try to bring that back. I think America does better when something like that is occurring.
Now, Mr. Perlmutter, a follow-up to that, I guess, is, if come January 2025, we again have another slim majority, but it's a slim Democratic majority, should potentially a Speaker Jeffries and Democratic leadership be willing to enter into the same kind of bipartisan coalition?
I think they should be open to it, because I think then, you're not, if you have a solid group on the other side of the aisle to add to most of the people on your side of the aisle, you can manage things and not be always looking over your shoulder saying, okay, I wasn't ideologically pure on this, and I'm going to face repercussions within my caucus and everything else. You're able to move things forward, even if it isn't perfect from one person's point of view or another. It still advances the cause of America. And I would certainly counsel Hakeem, and I think Rodney and I have actually had personal experience where we were working on some things that were a little dicey, but we Rodney and I and members of our Modernization Committee had come together on some things. We went to both Kevin McCarthy and Hakeem Jeffries, and we were able to forge a deal, even though it was potentially a problem for the entire group of us. And it can be done. It certainly can be done. And now, as I'm thinking about that, Rodney, Kevin certainly was stood up and helped us in that instance. So I'll take back a little bit of what I said, but I think Hakeem really is a person who would look to do things in a bipartisan way, because I think he believes it makes America stronger.
I'm going to get to my last question here, but I'll just remind folks again who are watching to submit your questions online. You can do that in the chat on Facebook or YouTube. And if you are on Twitter, you can use hashtag BPC Live. In that same op-ed, Leader Jeffries noted the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which you both served on, and offered it as a model or offering some models for how the House can function, given the slim majority and divisions between and within the parties. For both of you, what were the lessons of that modernization effort?
Go ahead, Mr. Davis.
Well, I had to sit next to Ed Perlmutter a lot. And, that was good some days, that was bad other days. No, I will tell you, every committee, and a select committee like the Select Committee on Modernization, really depends upon who's leading it. And the true leader of that committee for both terms was Derek Kilmer, our colleague from Washington State. Such a good person and such a dedicated legislator who was really focused on coming up with bipartisan solutions. And I got to give the first co-chair or vice chair, Tom Graves, a lot of credit. The second vice chair, the second term, William Timmons, got to give him a lot of credit too. But in the end, what we were able to accomplish, and I hope Ed agrees with me, is early on in the process in 2019 to 2021, we were able to actually take care in a very bipartisan way of a lot of intricate, low-hanging fruit issues that needed to be addressed internally with how Congress operates. And eventually you run out of those areas of bipartisan agreement, 100% consensus. And then when we got into the second term, individuals outside of the Modernization Committee decided to look at that as a chance to address issues that couldn't be addressed on the House floor. And that's when I think you saw the modernization become a little more partisan and a little more selective of what we should and what we could address. I think overall, the mission of the Modernization Subcommittee remained through both terms. And I think it remains today, where the Republicans have implemented my idea that I came up with my team before I left the position of ranking member of House Administration. They've actually implemented a subcommittee of the Committee on House Administration that deals completely with modernization, because in the end, an equal number of Republicans and Democrats on a committee, like we had with the Select Committee during the last two terms, was not able to make a decision sometimes on issues that needed to have a decision made. And I think the best step is to actually codify that modernization process as part of House administration and moving forward, hopefully in perpetuity.
Yeah, I felt the Modernization Committee accomplished a lot in the two terms that it operated, and it was equal number of Democrats, Republicans. Really, the chairs, Derek Kilmer and William Timmons, operated hand in glove. They worked together. The staffs worked together. There was just not everything can be sweetness and light. But there were a lot of, as Rodney said, low-hanging fruit where really could make the place run better just on a day-to-day basis. But also we did take on some bigger issues. And, some of those we did get enough agreement, which I think was like 2/3 or something like that. We had to have to move things forward. And we got a lot of that. So, I was on some pretty partisan committees, particularly the Rules Committee. And, you look at what we were able to do on the Modernization Committee, where we had those equal numbers. We were able to get a lot done, and there wasn't a lot of acrimony. It was just all of us seeing us wanting to get work done. And it was a good group looking to do that. And I think there are other places where the Congress can do it. I mean, sometimes you got to take a vote, and one side's going to win, and one person's going to win, or one idea is going to win, and not another. But we've made it very combative in the Congress. And then you add social media and some of the other things that Rodney talked about earlier. It gets more combative, and the conflict really rules instead of cooperation. But I think that committee showed that we can cooperate, get things done, important things that have been sitting around for a long time because nobody was willing to take them up. And so I I guess I'm optimistic that there's an opportunity to further that.
A couple of the committee's recommendations really come to mind just in the last week. One, something we've already touched on related to Speaker pro tempore McHenry's authorities and the authority of that position going forward. The Modernization Committee ended up making a recommendation calling for Congress to address some of the still out there continuity issues, and this one raised some additional continuity of government questions. And then the other one being that there are some still longstanding complaints about how the legislative process works in the House, how open it is to bipartisanship, how the House decides what bills will come to the floor, the ability to amend things now like the motion to vacate. The committee called for a task force and within the Congress to look at both of these issues. Do you think that's more pressing now, given that we're faced with some of these challenges, not in the theoretical, but in reality?
Well, I'll start on this one because one of the things that I was working on a lot was the continuity of government and what we had seen. And this one got more difficult because ultimately there's a constitutional element to all of this. And, we're trying to figure out, how do you continue government if there had been a catastrophic attack or COVID had wiped everybody out? How do you keep the House of Representatives in being and being able to function? We talked about speakers, but we never thought about it in the form of an ouster. I guess I never did. Maybe Rodney did, but I never really thought about it in that respect. So there's a lot of work to be done, and that's a big one, the continuity of government. And it's one that's fraught with some political, traps and debate and differences. But I think, again, if good people sit down and spend some time, there are a lot of steps that can be taken to improve the situation we have right now. So, and I think that starts from sort of the guts of the Modernization Committee, which was an evenly split committee with folks concerned about the institution and how it affects everyday Americans.
Well, and this is why I'm glad that we actually have given the Modernization Committee subcommittee status under a full committee, so that I believe more action can be taken on recommendations that we came up with when we were there that still haven't been addressed, and future recommendations. Look, this is a time where Republicans and Democrats should come together and really focus on the continuity of government. And that's why I'm glad that subcommittee exists with Derek Kilmer as vice chair and Stephanie Bice as the chair. I think they're both working very well together, like we witnessed when Democrats were in the majority and I was part of the minority. Look, continuity of government is not a sexy issue to address. But if you look back to the baseball shooting, where my friends and I were on a baseball field and a left-wing nut job came up and tried to literally change the balance of power in government by executing me and my friends. And frankly, if Steve Scalise, with his security detail that was not there that day, there were enough of us on the field that it would have changed the majority in Congress if he would have executed us all. So these are real issues. You couple that with what we're going through now with an ousted speaker through the motion to vacate, it is even more important, more imperative that Congress decides to look at the continuity of government issues and make decisions on it. This should be an area of bipartisanship, but in today's polarized environment, who knows?
Yeah, I just would add to that, January 6th also, really impresses on the need for something like this. It's a big undertaking, and it's one that requires a lot of effort on the part of a lot of people, but it does need to be done. And we made some suggestions. Again, it's something that just got to be hammered out. And I think Rodney's subcommittee is a good place for that to start. Ultimately, it's got to see the light of day on the floor of the House, and something's got to be done.
You mean like all those great amendments I brought in front of you in the Rules Committee, and you forgot we were bipartisan? Are you kidding me, Eddie?
It was always, I enjoyed every time you came up to the Rules Committee. That's all I'm going to say.
We had a good time.
Jim Saxa has a question. This may be more for you, Mr. Davis, but Mr. Perlmutter, if you want to take a swing at it, we'll let you too. Speaker McCarthy was ousted after passing a spending bill, as was Speaker Boehner. Paul Ryan also was forced out by the far right. Why won't the next GOP speaker's fate be the same?
Well, first off, Jim, great question. I'm glad you asked me to answer this, Michael, because I know Ed well enough to know, as a Broncos fan, his ability to focus and answer questions after 30 minutes goes severely downhill, just like the Broncos do in the second half.
All right, stop with the Broncos.
As a Raider fan, I don't have too many teams I can trash. That is one of them. So, yes, you were right. Speaker Boehner, after a reopening government, after the 2013 shutdown and moving ahead on other debt limit bills, was targeted with a motion to vacate. Conveniently, on July 31st, or the last day we were in Congress in July, right before an August break, so that a sociopathic narcissist like Mark Meadows could get all the attention he wants. Where have you seen that recently? And then Paul Ryan was not ousted. Paul Ryan decided not to run again, and then did not seek re-election. And we went into the minority and elected Kevin McCarthy as a leader. But I would argue that all of those instances where spending bills came to a head were all completely foreseen. We knew that we were going to get to that part of governing during that congressional session. So the undercurrent of discontent by a select few against John Boehner, against Paul Ryan, and against Kevin McCarthy was not just related to the spending bills that most of us voted for. So in the end, I don't think Kevin was ousted because he didn't shut government down. He came up with a principal compromise. I think that was just the excuse that another sociopathic narcissist, Matt Gaetz, used to implement the motion to vacate.
Yeah, I think it goes deeper than that. At the end of the day, Kevin McCarthy was not going to blow up the government and blow up America. He believes in governing. He believed in moving things forward, and I will give him that. I knew that at the end of the day, despite trying to placate the right or some ideological folks who, really don't like the thought of governing, they're more anarchistic than they are, in terms of wanting to make things work. That's going to be the problem that the Republicans are going to have for a while, until that element of just, we don't like government, we don't care if it works, like it or not, it has to work. It brings some order to the chaos of what would otherwise exist, and it's going to be hard for any Republican speaker, for the foreseeable future. So maybe I'm wrong, but that's kind of what I've been seeing over the last 10 years.
Last question here from David Plasterer. What do you make of Tom Cole saying the deal McCarthy made with the Freedom Caucus is void and they can write new appropriations bills based off of the Fiscal Responsibility Act? Is the next speaker bound by whatever agreements Speaker McCarthy had made?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And actually, that is Tom Cole. Certainly would, if I were in the House of Representatives, which I'm not, and I can say this, he would have my support every day of the week. And Rodney would have had my support, even though I don't like his football team. He would. I mean, there are folks who you may disagree with, but you can certainly sit down and talk and try to iron stuff out. Tom Cole is one of those guys. And I appreciate him making that statement, because that is a first step towards getting this thing working again.
Well, I completely agree. Tom Cole is absolutely right. Hell no. No one should be held accountable for a deal that the former speaker put in place. And frankly, I think that's a good place for any new speaker to start. Again, we're in uncharted territories. I'd urge your viewers to pay very close attention to what happens with the Republican conference today. Delve into questions that are being asked about that process. Ignore every question about Donald Trump's influence. Ignore every question about somebody from outside of Congress coming in to be speaker. Focus on what is in front of us. Is it going to be, did the rules change get implemented to require 217 in the conference before it goes to the floor? And if it did or if it didn't, who is going to be the person nominated by the Republican conference? That's what you should pay attention to today.
All right. Well, just in a wrap up, we'll maybe just do a rapid fire question here for both of you. Your best guesses on when you think the next speaker will be nominated by the Republican conference.
Well, before Ed's 80th birthday, which is next year.
Oh, I don't know why I agreed to be on this panel with Rodney, but I would say I just don't see it coming together until there's a bipartisan approach to this, because there are some folks who are not going to be happy in the Republican caucus that are not going to be happy with anybody. And if it's ideologically pure individual, then there are going to be a bunch of moderates who don't like that. So I think it's going to be a while, but this is an interesting game of handicapping. I'd say probably 30 days.
Yeah, I will tell you too, Michael, and it's going to depend upon whether or not this rule passes. If the rule passes, I think we're probably likely to have a speaker in a shorter time period, because remember, the rule doesn't pass and somebody gets just a simple majority. That's when the performance artists of my party, and the Democrats aren't immune to having performance artists. It always amazed me. Those who talked the most on the floor, those who got the most media attention, were the ones who were least likely to talk in a conference meeting, least likely to let their opinion be known. In the end, I think that one decision Republicans will make will decide whether or not this is a little more protracted than it should be.
And Michael, we got a little bit of a moving target too, because the numbers in the House could change. Santos could be there, somebody could get sick, somebody could resign. I mean, those numbers are changing. So the whole thing is a very interesting political science class for master's program or something, I guess.
Certainly, and I imagine there are going to be many a political science thesis written about this period that we're living through. So, Mr. Davis, Mr. Perlmutter, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our viewers. And